Hello everybody. Hopefully everybody's doing good and excited for our clinic today. I'd like to thank the people from Mesa Boogie for coming, Barry, Randall, the whole Mesa family for coming. This is going to be pretty awesome. If you have any questions, I assume at some point we're going to be answering them. So without further ado, Randall, I'm going to pass this over to you. Beau on guitars welcomes you.
Thank you, George. Thank you so much. Welcome, you guys. Thanks for coming. And I can tell by looking around that this is a boogie hotspot right here, and I really appreciate that. I'm going to start at the beginning, the real beginning. My grandmother came to California in a covered wagon. Now, she was 9 years old, so she was really aware of what was going on at the time, didn't really enjoy a minute of it. She said the hardships were unbearable and the wagon bounced so hard that she walked alongside of it. But here's the point that's most interesting, is that her family didn't know when they'd arrived because the destination was unknown. That's so opposite of what we do today. You know, we were following Siri and the navigation and all that that's telling us turn in a quarter of a mile and you'll be there in 13 minutes and all of that stuff. But imagine that, not knowing, but have an unknown destination. So how can you know when you've arrived when you don't know where you're going? Well, a tie-in is that kind of describes my life, as well as the way we design amplifiers too. We're not sure when we set out to make a new amplifier exactly how it's going to be. And at some point, the amplifier itself will start to take its own life and it will guide us along the way. And a lot of what it amounts to is leaving things out. Leaving things out. But back to my career and how I got started with this, it was the most fortunate number of circumstances, all of which were totally unpredictable, that led me to this point. My dad was a professional sax and clarinet player and arranger. He was an arranger for Spike Jones. Anybody remember that band? Yeah. And so he wanted to teach me how to play clarinet when I was a kid, and he forced me. Of course, I wanted to play all of the keys in a flurry of joy like Benny Goodman, like, you know, he played a lot of Benny Goodman for me. Wouldn't allow me to do that. No, you're going to play one note, the B natural, until you can play it to my satisfaction, and then I'll teach you the next note, B flat. So it took me 3 or 4 days of working on B natural. But the important thing was, is he was teaching me how to listen, how to hear tone and all the elements of tone before you can even begin to make tone, which of course with a wind instrument is a kind of an intimate and personal thing, since it's you breathing through the thing. It was a great lesson for a little kid. That came, well, I don't know, I was probably 8 years old, 8 or 9 when he started. But I still recall being an infant lying in the cradle, literally, with him playing, or my sister playing piano. She was a near prodigy piano student. And I remember being completely emotionally influenced by what she was playing. If she was playing, you know, and it was the Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Chopin, you know, all the usual musical piano works that students work. And I remember, this is before you learn language, music already has a big impact on you. So, you know, music has been a part of my life ever since the very beginning. Now, how did I get into electronics, you might ask? Well, it was through Boy Scouts, actually. And I wanted to get this one more merit badge that would put me over the top, to have more merit badges than any other kid that summer, and that would be rewarded with this cool medal that I really kind of wanted to get. A friend of mine said, just go for wood carving. It's the easiest merit badge there is. All you have to do is carve 3 things. So I did. I carved the 3 things. I looked up the merit badge counselor. He lived in the town I grew up in, Orinda, California, right over the Berkeley Hills. So I took my carvings, I went over to his place, and immediately it was like a little bit strange because I couldn't tell where his door was. He said, come to the garage. Well, the garage was boarded up. But I looked long enough and I could see a little line cut out where I guess that was the door. So I tapped on the door and nothing happened. I tapped on the door again. Finally it opens, and this big tall guy looks like Clint Eastwood on a bad day. Former combat Marine. And he opens the door, looks down at me, and he says, "Come in." So I walk in, and immediately I'm agog at all the equipment in this shop. It's just incredible. I don't even know what half of it is. And I say, "Well, here's my carvings." And I give him these 3 pieces of wood that I carved up. And he says, "Let me show you some of these tools. Let me show you the bandsaw. Let me show you how the bandsaw works." So he walks over, takes my, does this mic work too? I need a hand free here. I guess this one works. So he takes my 3 carvings, stacks them up like this, and turns on the bandsaw, looks me in the eye, saws them, turns them 90 degrees, looks me in the eye again, saws them that way, throws them in the trash barrel. And he looks at me and he says, "That's what I think of your projects, therefore that's what I think of you. And either you're totally hopeless," thank you, "or you didn't try very hard on this. But what do you think this garbage says about you?" Well, this was before the notion of a child's self-esteem had been invented. And I felt about as tall as the oil stain out on his driveway. And so I was severely busted, and because he was right. I hadn't paid it. I'd just done the quickest, crummiest job I could possibly do on these wood carvings. And but I didn't want to give up. So I said, "Well, Mr. Stilson, what do I need to do to earn this merit badge?" Well, I ended up spending several weeks working in and around him in his shop, sweeping up, carving things, sharpening tools, and being aware of what he was doing at that time. So in his garage, he built industrial control systems. Some of them were for refineries. What he was working on right at that very time was the heating and air conditioning control panels for the USS Nautilus, which was our first atomic submarine. So that puts this right around 1956 or 57. The guy was an artist as well as a craftsman and an engineer. All I knew was when I looked at what he did, I wanted to be able to do stuff like that just because the visual artistry was so stunning. The details, the proportions, and the density and the way everything was laid out just looked so hip and cool to me that I wanted to be able to do this. Whether anything I've ever made would work or not was secondary. I just wanted to make something that looked that pro. Well, it turned out that his son, oh, by the way, let me finish on the Boy Scout thing. So we're coming to the end of summer, and I'm, "Mr. Stilson, have I earned that merit badge, do you think?" So what he does, he sets down a stool like this, didn't have the Mesa logo on it, little wooden stool, and he says, "I want you to sit here for 20 minutes and think about the way you were when you came here. And then I'm going to come back and ask you if you think you ordered, or that you earned that merit badge." And I got to tell you, I thought about it long and hard, and I was close to telling them that I didn't deserve that merit badge because I felt so bad still about coming in there with this super quick, I didn't care kind of stuff. At any rate, that lesson about you're leaving behind an artifact of your values. Whenever you make anything, you're leaving behind a permanent artifact of what your values were at that time. I have never, ever, ever forgotten that. And that, again, it goes back to why we do the things that we do, and in a lot of cases, they're pretty neurotic, but they do matter. Well, let me finish with my my dear granny, because it's so cool. So I'm sitting there at her kitchen table with her, and I say, "Geez, think about this. This is so incredible. Think about this. In the span of your lifetime, you came to California in a covered wagon, and you flew to New York in a 747 jetliner. What do you think of that?" Well, she drifts off for a minute and thinks about it, and then she turns and looks at me and says, "Well, you know, the airplane was better." So I sort of dug that. I thought that was right to the point, and how simple can you get? And again, of course, I'm thinking of the titanium used in the fan blades and the jet engines and the aerodynamics and the electronics and all that. For her, it was simple. The airplane was better. Now that actually applies to what we do here too, because one of the things that we seek to do is to make things simpler. Simpler. Complex things made simple is one of the most difficult things there is to do. And the most recent one that I'm still really thrilled about is right here in these Cal Tweeds, and this is a multi-watt power switch. Now, excuse me. Pretty much everything that multi-watt power switch does, I've already done in different forms, in different amplifiers. Different switches, different amplifiers, triode, pentode, 2 tubes, 4 tubes, Class A, Class AB, and all of that. It's scattered all over. So I was thinking, yeah, what's the chance? How could I get a patent on that? Because I've already done all of that stuff. And then it occurred to me that the genius of that switch is the fact that it simplifies all of that electronic mumbo jumbo, and it presents it in a way that is immediately apparent, and the benefits are immediately apparent to a guitar player who doesn't need to know or care about triode, pentode, Class A, single-ended, A, B, push-pull, parallel, and all that. I don't care any more than my grandmother cared what it took to make that 747 fly. She just thought it was better. And that's the key to this switch right here, and that patent flew right through, I gotta say. It flew right through. And I had to mention all of those elements that I'd already done before, because so I cited all my own prior art to make sure that if I got it, that Fender or somebody couldn't say, oh, that patent should be invalid because you already did it. So what the patent really speaks to is it lists all of this complicated electronic switching and different ways of arranging power tubes that are throughout our fleet of amplifiers. But it focuses on the simplicity and the ease of understanding and using in the one switch. So what it was all about was one switch. How simple is that? And do you really care? I mean, some of you guys, I'm sure there's some techno geeks in here that really want to think about or hear about Class A, single-ended, Class A, B, push, pull, parallel, triode, pentode, all of the stuff that these switches do. Look, I've also done some car hot rodding and know hot rodders and so forth and so on. So I know what the fundamental building blocks are. It used to be the Ford Flathead V8, right? You guys, the older guys would know that engine. 1955, along comes the Chevy small block overhead valve, a huge step up in engine technology, and that of course became the hot rod and race car building block. And me, Fender is the building block that I stand on. I stand on the shoulders of what Fender did, and I'm just trying to be the hot rod guy, like those guys at Edelbrock, pick your flavor, that can take a Chevy engine and make it perform twice as well as GM could. And one of the reasons why, this is no slagging off on GM, it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier before everybody came in. Economy becomes a huge element in anything that's produced in enormous quantities. Now, the number of small block Chevys that have been made, I think about 8 or 9 years ago, the number was 200 million. So it's probably 250 million or more by now. That is a lot. So if you can save a penny or a dime on each one, that's worth it. The other thing is that most people aren't that interested in performance in their car. They just want it to start and be reliable. They drive it to the grocery store, drive it to work and so forth. They're not hot rodders, they're not racers. But we are. And you guys are. Anybody that showed up here is obviously interested in performance amplifiers, and that's what we do. And it's still all vacuum tubes, nothing else. I don't even know anything else. And the only reason why I know vacuum tube electronics is because I've been doing it for not 50 years, that's Mesa Boogie. I've been doing it probably for 60 years, if not a little bit more. Educationally, no. Never took a class in electronics, not even high school, college, never took a class at all. Just my good fortune to have tried so many different things along the way, to be exposed to so many different things. I'll tell you a couple of the crazy ones here. Where I grew up, Orinda, is right over the hills from Berkeley. Now, I wasn't a jock. I couldn't wait to get out of school. When that bell rang, I am gone. And so the idea of, don't you want to stay after to play football or something like that? I was like, no, I am out of here. And so what I did for a lot of it was I would go into Berkeley and, you know, scout out the beatnik coffee shops, the used bookstores, the art galleries and stuff, and I was trying to understand the existential dilemma, and I was really interested in learning everything that I could about everything that I could find out about. And that kind of worried my parents, so even though I was accepted to Cal, they said, you're going to Cal Santa Barbara, because we want to get you away from Berkeley. We're afraid you're going to go completely off the deep end. That didn't work out too well for them, because what happened was I never really fit in down at Santa Barbara. That was a party school, surf school and all that, and all my friends were up in Berkeley, including my girl. So what did I do? Almost every Friday, I'd hitch from the campus, which was about 10 miles outside of Santa Barbara. I'd go down to Santa Barbara and hop a freight train going up north to the Bay Area. I hoped. Sometimes they didn't. This is back to, again, you don't know where you're going, you don't know what the destination was. I knew what my hoped for destination was. It was the freight yards in Oakland. But my God, I mean, one time I ended up in Vandenberg Air Force Base, which was the missile launching place, and that was a highly restricted place. And I remember the train stopped, and it was the middle of the night, and I thought, we couldn't be here yet, but I was still kind of asleep. When I finally wandered out of there, past the guard gate, that guy freaked out, because how did you get in here? You know, I had a long time explaining to him how I kind of rode in on this freight, on this boxcar, thinking that I was headed to Oakland, and the train stopped here. So what can you do? And you know what? The train doesn't care. The train's going where the train wants. A freight train is like, you don't have a ticket, it's going where it goes, you don't care. So what did I do at Berkeley? Yeah, well, I played in a blues rock band and delivered newspapers because I didn't have any money and all of that. And what was my course? What did I study? Well, a little of this, a little of that, a little of the other thing. But the main thing that I ended up spending time on was, believe it or not, creative writing. They had a creative writing course that was open only by select invitation to a handful. I think it was limited to 10 people. I was perpetually in that for the simple reason, I just wrote down these freight train stories, and they read them and they just said, Jack Kerouac, man, this guy is like Jack Kerouac. Of course, I read every Jack Kerouac I could get my hands on too. Who else read Jack Kerouac? Any on the road? Oh, there you go, cool. So that was my inspiration. So, and you know, that really helped me too, because I ended up writing all of the patents. I can't afford to have a patent lawyer write this stuff up, and they don't even understand what it's about anyway. Here's a perfect example. I'm going to jump forward, and then I'll try to remember where I was, and I'll jump backwards. When I came up with the Mark II, part of the issue with the Mark II was that I missed the opportunity to file a patent on high gain for the Mark I. And after you sell something commercially for a year, you lose the rights to file a patent. At that point, you've donated it to the public domain. I didn't want to make that mistake again. So with the Mark II, I would come up with basically mode switching, often called channel switching. That's not correct, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So I wrote the patent for a dual mode amplifier, an amplifier that had two performance modes, not two channels. You think of a normal Fender has two channels, but the performance is the same, except the right-hand channel might have reverb and tremolo. Gain structure, tone controls, all that's identical. There's no really point in switching from one channel to the other. That's why it's not channel switching, it's mode switching, because the other mode was high gain, lead enhancement by generating distortion in the preamp stage. So I write up the patent that describes this, right? And submit it, and then I get this call. And guess who the call is? It's the guy who says, I am Jay Cantor's father. Now, Jay Cantor was the guy who submitted it. That's all he did. You can't just send it into the United States Patent Trademark Office. It has to be sent in by somebody licensed to. So that was this guy, Jay Cantor, who I had never met. I'm Jay Cantor's father, and I am the retired former head of the United States Patent Trademark Office Amplifier Arts Division. I want to know who wrote this patent. And I go, oh, that bad, huh? That was me, sir. Well, that patent is the best written application I have ever read. I'm going, oh, wow, really? I'm thinking, I thought the guy was gonna just tell me, forget it, you're nuts. But then the next thing he said revealed it all. After he said, this is the best written patent application I've ever read, then he says, but it won't work. Well, hell, I knew it worked already. I was building it, players were loving it. He said, you can't put that many 12AX7s in a row without creating distortion. And I'm thinking, my God, that's the whole point of the thing. That's what it spells out. How could I have written it so well and you didn't understand it at all? Here's the reason why he didn't understand it, because he came from an engineering background. Anybody with an engineering background thinks of amplifiers and distortion as you would think of food and food poisoning, right? You don't want any amount of food poisoning in your food. Just a little bit's okay. Oh, I want to enhance the food with a lot of poisoning. No, it doesn't think that way. But that's what we do. What we do, again, is akin to my granny, not knowing where she was going and not knowing when she got there because the destination was unknown. In the engineering circles, the destination is really clearly known in amplifier art. Think of a hi-fi amp. You want no distortion or as low a distortion as you can possibly get, and you want as flat a frequency response as you can possibly get. That's diametrically opposite of what we do and what you guys want to hear. If you ever plug your guitar into a hi-fi amp, you will know just exactly how awful that sounds. So one night on the gig, the keyboard player's Sun 200S amp blows up. That's an amp with big power tubes in it. Anybody remember that amp at all? Sun 200? See, they come, they go. This gentleman remembers them. I mean, flame, spark, smokes, the whole thing. He's devastated because we're penniless. And he's like, I don't know how we're going to go. I don't have the money to get a new amp. I said, well, let me see if I can fix it for you. He's like, fix it? You fix it? What are you talking about? I said, well, I used to build some ham radio stuff when I was a kid. Let me have a look at it. I promise you I won't make it worse, and it's blown up right now. I don't know how it could be much worse. Anyway, long story short, I look inside, see all the burned up parts, go down to the electronics store, buy a bunch of resistors and some capacitors, replace all the burnt parts, put it back together, and it works. Now, to me, as a kid who grew up with a Bug-Eye Sprite, that's the small Austin Healey. Some of you older guys might remember that. It was a 1959 Austin Healey, which, by the way, turns out, the little Sprite turns out to be the fastest of all of those little cars. But it has a small engine. The engine's too small, and the engine, doesn't last any time at all. So, same thing, I had rebuilt that engine, gosh, I don't know how many times, 8, 10 times I'd rebuilt it. You get a year and a half out of the engine and it's just blowing. So of course I had it hot rodded up with high compression pistons and a hot cam and a milled head and then headers and everything, the light and flywheel, everything you could possibly do to it. And I'm a 16, 18-year-old kid abusing the daylights out of it. Of course it doesn't last very long. The point is, I thought repairing stuff was just how you dealt with life. Nobody's going to buy you a new car. Nobody's going to buy Dave a new amp. He doesn't have the money to get a new amp. But 2 days after I fixed that Sun 200, he says, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're going to open a music store. And I just laughed at him. I said, what do you mean what do we know about opening a music store? I have the slightest idea. That thought never would have occurred to me. And he says, well, you can fix stuff. And everybody in the Bay Area is playing in bands, and there's nobody around that can fix this shit. So I found a place in Berkeley, just 2 blocks from his house. And it's a storefront for $75 a month. So we opened that. What were we going to call it? Oh, let's call it Prune Music. Within no time at all, I became the go-to repairman, because he was right about that. There was nobody to fix this stuff, and all these Bay Area bands started coming to me. Everyone you heard of, and 25 or 30 that you never heard of. And I took this responsibility really, really seriously, especially as I'm thinking, man, if I'm the last guy working on that amp and it blows up on some gig for Airplane, Grateful Dead, Steve Miller, and these tons of other bands that you never heard of, I'm not going to be too happy, and they're really not going to be happy. It's going to be a reflection on me. So I took it extremely seriously. and would fix anything. And I had people bringing me stuff, Hohner keyboards and stuff that was basically not that good, and you really didn't want to be the last person, because then they would blame you for stuff that was intrinsically weak or bad or wrong with the item. So I started narrowing it down to stuff that I really liked and that you could fix and it would stay fixed. Fender amps. And one day, well, there were some other Standells, but again, they were a little unpredictable. Anybody remember Standell amps? Yeah, good. So one day this truck pulls up and this big bear of a guy gets out and says he's with Country Joe and the Fish. Anybody ever remember them? Good. Well, I found out recently from Barry Melton, who came by the Mesa shop, a year or two ago now, and we sat down and reminisced and all that, and he said, this blew my mind, he said, do you know that Led Zeppelin used to open for us? Now, Country Joe and the Fish, just like the name sounds, this was basically a Berkeley pre-hippie, because hippies hadn't been invented yet, or at least the name hadn't, sort of country rock band, nice guys. At any rate, the thing was, first thing he says was, look, this stuff takes a real beating and I want it all checked out before I go on the road. And as he's saying this, he's opening the back door to the truck and a showman head falls out and lands right on the street. He says, see what I mean? So I thought, that was a wake-up moment for me. I thought, wow, you know, what goes on with this stuff in the rock and roll life, it's really, a lot of it is mechanical abuse, just stuff getting slammed around, loaded, unloaded, you know, what happens. So to make sure that his stuff wasn't going to break, I came up with this hammer test, and I was pretty worried about it at first, but I thought, okay, well, nobody's watching. Let me see what happens if I just take this hammer, turn this chassis out of the cabinet, and I start banging on it with a hammer. Well, something blows up. I fix that so it won't blow up again. Start banging on it again, something else fails. So with the point I was trying to reach, and I did reach it here, was then you could slam on it endlessly and nothing further would break, right? We still do that hammer test to every Mesa Boogie. And we have freaked out some guys that is like, they'll come up to the factory, would you just go over my amp or something like that? And one of the guys looks at it, yeah, we'll do this. And bam, 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 the guy, what are you doing? There's something, this guy is, you know, like, his treasured item. He's been so delicate, he won't let anybody else handle it. Here's the factory, the guy's just beating it up with a hammer. And he freaks out. So then the next thing that happened with the same guy, Dave Faison from Country Joe and the Fish, this happened later after we moved the store from Berkeley across the bay to Mill Valley, and that was really a good move. That was propitious. And the way that happened was one day some guy, and this is a funky music store, that big on the walls. That's it. That's Prune music. Well, what do you expect for 75 bucks a month? This guy walks out and he said, what a cool store. We ought to open a store like this in Mill Valley. Well, Mill Valley was like the holy grail. That was like the most beautiful part of the Bay Area. It's right north end of the Golden Gate Bridge. It's all redwood trees and ferns and beautiful girls, and it's just phenomenal. So we all were like, this like vacation paradise. We'd all want to go over there on the weekends if we could. So once we heard this guy say, man, we ought to open a store like this in Mill Valley, David and I looked at each other and we turned around the sign. It said closed on one side of the sign. The other side said, sorry, we're open. And we went over and rented this little storefront, 34 Sunnyside. That was a temporary deal, and within 6 months or so, we moved down the street to what was a much bigger, better place. It was probably about the size of this store right here. The same guy, David Faison from Country Joe and the Fish, shows up later and he says, hey, I got this little Fender Princeton. Is there anything you could do to this amp that would just blow Barry Melton's mind? And I'm thinking, oh man, you're talking to the right guy here, because with that little Bug-Eye Sprite, what I always fantasized about was if you could take a little aluminum V8 like General Motors was making then for Buicks and Oldsmobiles, if you could put a little lightweight V8 in that car and keep it totally stock looking, that would be the ultimate sleeper. That would blow the doors off anything in any kind of race, street race, road race, drag race. It would just, and if it looked totally stock, wouldn't that be a hoot? Of course, I never got around to doing that. But I wanted to do that same concept with his amplifier. Now, we were already huge fans of the 410 Tweed Bassman. Not a good bass amp, but a great blues guitar amp. Now, you guys are all familiar with that, right? The Tweed Legacy of Fender. Again, I'm standing on their shoulders, giving them credit. So what did I do? I took the Princeton and stripped everything off of, took the little dinky transformers out, and sawed big holes in the chassis so I could get the big transformers in, and I built it up like a slightly boosted 410 Tweed Bassman. Then I looked at the little Tweed, the little Tolex cabinet with a 10-inch speaker with a little tiny magnet, and I'm going, well, that won't last 10 seconds. Can I fit a 12 in it? And you just barely can. The 12-inch speaker just went from the top to the bottom of the grill board, and I thought, okay, I'm going to saw that out, and I'm going to be real careful, and if I line it just right, the spokes will clear these giant transformers that I put in it. Put it all together. It seemed like it worked. It looked like it worked on the scope. I'm not a guitar player. So I took it out to the front of our store, Prune Music, which was a great social gathering place in Mill Valley. Mill Valley, if you probably never heard of it, any successful rock star in the Bay Area lived in Mill Valley, including Jimi Hendrix. And they all hung around at our shop, except Hendrix. I never got to meet him. I saw him drive by in his pink caddy a couple of times. I never got to meet the guy. I'm still sad about that. But there was a guy, just one of the local guys that hung out there. He did play in a band. It was called the Santana Blues Band. And I said, hey, Carlos, would you plug into this amp? And he goes, no, man, that's a Princeton. I don't want to plug into that amp. Because again, it was absolutely stock looking. You couldn't tell anything had changed. No, please, Carlos, plug. No, man, go Princeton, it's a practice amp. I don't want to play into that. Please, Carlos, I've jacked it up. See what I see plugs in. More than most players, Carlos is the kind of player that thrives on inspiration. And man, did he get inspired that day. He totally went off. And part of it was the amp. The amp sounded phenomenal. I won't kid you. It sounded like a 410 Bassman on a small dose of Viagra. And the doors were open, beautiful sunny summer afternoon, and with Carlos playing that way, a crowd started to form on the sidewalk as it was just so exciting. He finishes and he looks at the little amp and he goes, shit, man, that little thing really boogies. Okay, I'll take that. There's the name. There's where that part came from. Now you might want to know, where does the Mesa engineering come from? Well, the income I was making out of that music store was so paltry that I could already see what I wanted to do was, well, let me back up a little bit. The first thing that little boosted Princeton did was establish the concept of the high power, super compact 112 guitar amp. Nobody had ever made that configuration. Not really radical, but it was pretty radical because, again, it was like that little Sprite. It looked like a harmless, friendly little thing, but man, it was fully gig worthy, and it hauled ass. So I ended up, over the couple of years, over a year or two, ended up converting, God, I don't know, over 100 Princetons. Almost every Princeton in the Bay Area ended up getting boogieized. Until we ran out of chassis. And I was kind of like looking for a way to get out of Prune Music, but I was so broke. All right, I'm back to how did Mesa Engineering come about. I couldn't afford to buy new stuff because we actually bought a couple of brand new Fender Princetons and then stripped them and boogieized them. And I thought, wow, that is stupid. We're buying the amp and there's nothing, we're keeping nothing but the wooden box, basically. Luckily, going back to that Marine combat guy and working in his shop and building the radio transmitters there, I knew how to fabricate stuff from scratch, just from a piece of metal, a bunch of wires, and a bunch of components. So, but I needed the money to buy the transformers and buy the parts, and we were barely eking out a survival at Prune Music. So I picked up a couple of moonlight gigs. One of them was jacking up old houses, summer houses out in West Marin, starting with my own, because they were falling down. They were 70, 80 years old. They're half rotten in the hillside. You know, they were made as summer cabins. And jack them up, dig a trench, pour a foundation, level them, and set them back down. In fact, I got one of my favorite names, because we ended up doing about 4 or 5 houses like that, my friends and I, and we were making money doing it. My name became the Mole, because being the skinniest guy, I could crawl up where the bottom of the house just disappeared into the dirt and all the rot was, and I could, dig it out and so forth. The Mole, that was me. The other thing that I was doing, harken back to that Bug-Eye Sprite, kid came along 7,000 miles on or something. Everything else was just like new. I took it down to the machine shop, they mic'd the cylinders, and the guy went back and forth. And, there's no measurable wear on this. And anyway, long story short, I put it all back together for my labor cost $0. The machining and the parts that I needed cost $75. And suddenly, I had just done what Mercedes wanted $1,100 for, right? So, ching, ding, ching, okay. So this guy, Bob, kept buying all these old Mercedes with, worn out and blown up engines, and I kept rebuilding. That's how I got the money to buy the first sets of transformers to start building what was to become the Mark I Boogies. I needed a straight sounding name. See, you thought I forgot where I was. I thought I forgot where I was too. But I'm trying to get to how the name Mesa Engineering came back. I couldn't call up Mercedes and say, hey, I need a set of bearings and rings. This is Boogie Engineering. They would have laughed and hung up. Same with I need 8 yards of concrete. Can you send a ready-mix truck to this address? Who is this? Oh, this is Boogie Engineering. So I just made up this name, Mesa Engineering, and it worked like a charm. Everybody thought, wow, that sounds, Mesa Engineering? Sure, I must have heard of them. That sounds familiar. So that's where Mesa Engineering came from. Okay, now the next thing, we talked about the high power, super compact 112 combo. The next thing that was needed by guitar players was the ability to separate distortion gain characteristics from playing loudness, because everybody's playing in blues and rock and roll bands. And as you all know, being guitar players, you want some distortion if you're going to play the blues, right? You want to, you listen to the old blues meisters, and who knows what they were playing, but basically it was turned up too loud and it was distorting, and they used that as a huge element of expressivity and the tone. But all of the amplifiers had this issue where the only way you could get that was to exceed the clean power capability of the amplifier. And around our Prune music store in Mill Valley, where all of these bands and players were hanging out, that was always the big problem. This is like a twin is too loud, and a Princeton distorts, but it's not loud enough. And maybe at a certain size room, a deluxe is okay. But so this thing, and Carlos Santana he had his Boogie Eyes Princeton with the 410 basement circuit, which definitely had better blues tone and more drive and distortion capabilities than any blackface, for example. But I remember him saying, man, they just done the sustain, man. I need to get some sustain. And is there anything you can do to get me some sustain? I want this sound. I hear this sound in my head. It's more like a saxophone because it just soars and it doesn't go pling and die out like a guitar string does. Or maybe a violin. It's got rich harmonics and you can just sustain it. Okay, so I hear what he's talking about, and in my mind, that was a great description. I understand what he's kind of looking for. Don't know how I'm going to achieve this until another bit of serendipity comes around. Well, Lee Michaels was another guy from Mill Valley that just hung around. A wonderful guy, and he's a real creative, inventive, kind of crazy guy that try anything, and. He had bought some crown. You all think of him as playing a Hammond B3 and singing his ass off. That was his main instrument. But he also wanted to play guitar because he said, look, I love the Hammonds, but I want to have my fingers right where the source of the note is coming. And with the guitar, that's it. Your fingers on the fret and your other fingers on the plucking the string. That's what I want. So he took up guitar. Then he bought these Crown DC 300A power amps, which were a revolutionary, almost like a piece of laboratory gear. They were the first real high power transistor amplifiers. But nobody could make a preamp right. He said, man, I've hired Fender, I hired Acoustic and a couple other high-tech companies, and the preamp, they all sound terrible. They just don't work. You want to try to build me some? Well, I go back to my roots, the trusty 410 Tweed basement circuit with 12AX7 tubes, and I'm thinking, I have no idea really what kind of signal it takes to drive that crown. So what if I added another 12AX7 to that basement preamp circuit? Now that'll make it go crazy. It'll have so much gain, it'll be unstable, it'll be freaking, okay, I know what I'll do. I'll put some volume controls, level controls, gain controls, it's all the same name, same thing, different names. I'll just sprinkle them throughout the circuit. I have one here, and one in the end. One in the beginning, one in the middle, one in the end. And then I can get down and adjust them, and maybe I can find out what balances and works well with this crown. So I take it over to Lee's place. Now you got to picture, Lee is a rock star. Here I am, humble guy with my little preamp here, and we plug it in, and it doesn't work. I'm just crushed. I'm going like, oh man. And so I'm ready to unplug it and go back home and try to figure out what happened, lick my wounds. And was like ready to unplug it. I go, wait a minute, Lee, you plugged the preamp right into the 412 cap. The crown isn't in the signal chain. That's why it's not working. Meanwhile, we turned all of these level controls up and up and up because we could hear this little faint sound. The preamp had so much juice, it was actually driving the 412 cabinet, but you know, at a very soft level. So he plugs it back in this time, so the preamp goes into the crown and the crown goes into the 412 cab like it's supposed to. He hits a power cord, and my God, it just blew our bodies across the room. It was like something nobody had ever heard before. Not only could, and then we sat down and started twisting all of these gain controls that I had. And you could set it so that it was the loudest, best Fendery clean sound you ever heard. That was what we expected. But this other thing became apparent, and that was that we could juice up the front end of the thing, the front end in the middle of it with all this extra gain, and then control the actual loudness level so that we could adjust how loud it was independent of how much gain it had. The other thing was that it had gain that up until that moment had never been heard or experienced before. Let me tell you why. A 12AX7 has the capability of delivering 100 times gain, not 100% more, but 100 times more. And by adding that, now when you actually put it in the circuit, it won't quite do that. It'll max out at about 80 or so, and that's everything turned up. So the point I'm getting at is by adding that extra stage into the preamp signal change, the thing had, let's just call it 80 times more gain than any preamp before that had ever had. So you could dial in this distortion overdrive that nobody had ever heard before because nothing had ever been overdriven like that. And here's the other thing that it did that is so interesting. You all know the physics of a guitar string. You pluck the string, you get this explosive attack, and then the string vibration decays, right? So, but what would happen is that, okay, if in a normal gain amp like a Fender amp, and you could drive the thing, you could drive the speaker to full power, right? Turn up the amp all the way, you hit the thing, it goes bang, it dies down. Okay, when you increase the gain by, let's say, this factor of 80 times, what that means is that the string vibration could decay by 80%, so it's barely vibrating, but it's still driving the amp completely to full saturation. Does that make sense? Do I need to explain that a little bit more? See, everybody knows about gain now, but because it's been around ever since that day, really. Now, what happened too that was so cool was after I realized what I had more or less accidentally swerved into here, this high gain breakthrough, my immediate thought was, oh man, I can't wait to make a little 112 4-6L6 combo with that kind of gain for Carlos. And I did. And he recorded this album called Abraxas with that amp. And when he toured behind that great Abraxas album around the world, I started getting inquiries from everywhere he went because this tone was something nobody had ever heard before. And it's coming from this little tiny box. So I'm getting inquiries from, geez, Japan, England, Germany, South Africa, you name it, I'm getting these inquiries. In fact, Carlos tells a great story. He was hanging around up at the Mesa Tone Lounge not long ago and reminiscing, and he said, man, this story, Bob Dylan and I were riding in a cab in Manhattan with the Boogie amp in between us in the back seat, and we were headed to Madison Square Garden. The Stones were playing, and they said, you could sit in if you want. And as Carlos said, they gave him the nod, and he comes up with his little amp and sets it on the stage. And Keith looks at him and says, what is this? This is Madison Square Garden. We're the Rolling Stones. You brought a practice amp? This is the size of a Fender Princeton. It was a snakeskin, but it was the size of a Fender Princeton. Well, Carlos says, don't worry, let's just hang on. Well, they play their whole thing, and they get to a big crescendo, and Keith gives the nod to Carlos, and this is Carlos still talking now. And he hits one big note and holds it, and it just soars. He says it just soared right over the top of the Stones, just playing their hearts out. And Keith goes, what is that? Then I pick up the narrative and I said, and you know what happened after that? 2 days later, I got a call from Ian Stewart, the unknown Stone. You guys know him? Yeah. And he's telling me, he said, hey, we need to get an amp. We saw this little amp that Carlos had, and we need to get one. And I started to say, well, great, I'd love to build you one. I'm gonna have to ask you to send me a check. And I can hear Keith in the background, and they're talking, and Ian's going, well, no, wait a minute. We don't pay for gear, we're the Rolling Stones and all. I said, excuse me, is that Keith I hear in the background basically feeding you questions? He said, yeah, could you put him on, please? So Keith comes on, and he couldn't be a nicer guy. Right, mate, that amp sounds great. I want to get one. I said, Keith, I'm sorry to tell you, I'm a starving cat here. I need you to pay for that. Well, wait a minute. No. I know, I understand, but I'm not some big corporation, and we still aren't. But Keith, I'm a starving cat here. It's just me. Besides, if I could afford to build amps and give them away, wouldn't it be more righteous to give one to, say, some old broken down blues player? They have the highest reverence for that. So he agreed. He said, yeah, that would be a more appropriate thing. I said, besides, Keith, I'm reading about your tax problems, and I know all you guys you're trying to get out from under the tax man. So here's what I'm thinking. You send me the check, write it off on your tour expenses, so it's a tax deduction. I'll build you the amp, and if you don't love it, then there's in such great demand, you can sell it immediately for cash. And you can use the cash to buy drugs. There is a long pause. A long pause, and I'm thinking, oh man, I blew it. He was too friendly, and I was too enjoying the moment, or might have had a toke, I don't know what. He comes back on, and right, mate, that'd be a great plan, but I know I love the amp because I already played Carlos's, and I want 6. Give me the dig, and I'm gonna have Jane Rose write you a check. They bought 46 amps over the decades, and they are the most wonderful, down-to-earth guys. Now here's one of the big differences between them and me. The problem I had was my dad being a legit musician. Actually, he was first chair clarinet at the Oakland Symphony. He always liked that better than playing in the dance band, the 40s dance band kind of stuff, big bands. So he was always beating me in, technique and skill and all of that. And so I grew up with that in mind, not realizing that the essence of rock and roll was partying, having fun, getting the girls, and just going crazy, having a rock and roll attitude. I figured that out way too late. But I'll tell you what, the Stones have got the most wonderful attitude. They seem to really enjoy themselves. I've been with them in Oakland, Tokyo, San Francisco, London, and Paris. And in every place, they're having a ball. Whether they're recording or whether they're playing, they seem to really be having a great time. And just nothing but fun. No wonder they still do what they do, because they just absolutely love it. So down to earth, so much fun. And obviously the nicest guys. You got to picture Lagunitas. It's under the redwood trees, way out in West Marin, where I could actually afford. That's where these summer cabins and stuff were. And that's where I started. That's where I was building the amplifiers after I gave away my half of Prune music, which was worth what I got for it, which was essentially nothing. So I'm building these amplifiers, and I'll tell you how much I'm building them is I am creating the sheet metal chassis. I taught myself how to silk screen so I could silk screen front panels I taught myself how to make printed circuit boards. I always thought that was the way to go in terms of achieving consistency. So I was making my own printed circuit boards, screening them and etching them. I had a hot acid bath and, you know, could etch the copper boards, drilling them, assembling them, building the whole amplifier, blah, blah, blah. I recently had a change of life where my previous wife died about 5 years ago, and I was so fortunate to almost immediately mutually fall in love with a tremendous girl. So I'm taking her around Boogie for the first time to introduce her. And the first guy we run into, I say, hey, Mike, this is Teresa. And they're chatting. And Mike, how long have you worked here? This was almost 5 years ago now, 4.5 years ago. Then he said, how long have I worked here? 39 years. So he was one of those guys. So we go around the corner to where the lady Marie is wiring the front panels to the amps. Hi, Marie, how you doing? How long have you worked here, Marie? And what she said was 29 years. Then we go around to my guy, John Marshall. We ignore his last name. Super nice guy, super nice guy. He was Kirk Hammett's childhood buddy, and he was a tech for Metallica. And he's a real tall guy. We call him long grain. And I introduced her and the same question. How long have you worked here? And he says, 24 years. They still call me the new guy. So these are who built your amps. If you got boogies, these are the people. There's a handful of people. Wire them all. We do virtually everything in Petaluma in our one little shop that used to be a cow pasture when I bought the land. Again, this was a lucky thing that I did when I was going up there. I was like, we couldn't run this in my house indefinitely. Although I will say, we built all of the Mark I's there. I think it was just shy of 3,000 Mark I's. And we were exporting to 39 foreign countries. And we had these problems of, by this time, I'm trying to get a bunch of transformers and a bunch of speakers and stuff, and tractor trailer would come up this narrow little country lane dead end thing, and they would get stuck. And it was just a nightmare, so it was time to move on. But luckily I'll never forget this too, I took every dollar I could ever beg, borrow, and steal, and saw that Petaluma, that's the place, because south of that, Marin County, everything's really expensive. North of that, everything's Santa Rosa, and that's really expensive. For some reason, this Petaluma area has been overlooked. And then, so I put the money down to buy this real estate. Then I changed my mind. It's like, I don't want to do that. I just want to stay at the home. I never want to grow. And so I went back up and I met the guy, an old farmer named Elmer Scott. I'll never forget, I said, so Elmer, there's no roads here or anything. And, Elmer, what did I buy? Show me what I bought. And he goes, he's a real rancher. Out there where them white-faced Herefords is grazing, that's yours. And there's this herd of cattle standing in the mud. And I'm thinking, oh man, did I blow it? That's mine. Oh no, I really blew it. Well, now when you look back, that was the anchor of what's become an industrial, a lightweight industrial area. So that all worked out good. Again, back to my grandmother. I don't know where we're going. I don't know when we've arrived because the destination is unknown. So I'm making these bold moves and then regretting them, but then it turns out good anyway because I was ahead of the curve and could afford it. The future is good. I'm super glad because our entire business relies on tubes. That's really all I do. That's all I know. And without the tubes, I'm done. I'm finished. You're exactly right. The company that I worked closely with was Sylvania, and they made the best 6L6s, and I worked with them to make them even better. And before you all arrived and we started this officially, I was telling the guys here, Lou and George and Harry, I was telling them about making the tubes better at the factory, and oh, that's really expensive if you want to do that. Well, how much more is it? Well, we'll get back to you on that. Well, I'd like to do this too. How much is that? And it turned out that these things that they said are really expensive, where one was a penny and a half and the other one was less than a penny. But the point is that they were geared up to be making millions of tubes. Now, obviously, most of the tube market had disappeared because people don't make tube radios, they don't make tube television sets. But they do make tube guitar amps, and so that's what I was trying to tell them, is that forget all of that stuff. Just make the the tubes that there is an OEM, original equipment manufacturer, requirement for. And boy, did they ever make some great tubes. In fact, the 6L6s that we get today are still modeled after the ones that I worked with them to make a super good 6L6. But what they told me at the end, they said, well, you know what the most expensive component of each tube we sell you is? I said, well, no. Is it the labor, or is it this part? The guy said, no, it's the heating bill. I said, what? It's the heating bill there in Altoona, Pennsylvania. It's the heating bill amortized throughout the year. And since this is such a small amount of production, we still have to keep the whole factory, warm enough, blah, blah, blah. Philips NV, the Dutch consortium, bought Sylvania, and the first thing they did was they shut down that factory. It was a real crying shame. Then the Chinese were making some tubes that weren't very reliable, but they did sound pretty good, and they were based on a real old-fashioned design. I couldn't get them to upgrade that. That was a different factory than the 12AX7 factory that I was telling you guys about earlier. The Russians were making some tubes, and here's an interesting reason why. You're all worried about electromagnetic pulse, if you've heard about the, shooting up some kind of a neutron bomb up in orbit and basically disabling all of the satellites that are up there. The Russians realized what a hazard that was. But the thing is, vacuum tubes are impervious to that, and so the Russians were still using tubes in their satellites for that very reason. If there was an electromagnetic pulse, they would be immune. And I'm sure the Russians were thinking, we can disable the United States satellites and ours will keep working. This is still an issue with North Korea and so forth and so on. You don't hear much about it, but it's a real thing. Is that solid state stuff, big pulse, it just shorts out. It just, the gaps between the conductive layers are so small that if you just hear, a giant voltage hits it, it just shorts out, it just arcs right out. Again, the vacuum tube's completely different technology. That isn't gonna happen. There's big spaces in between the elements of a tube. But yeah, so working with the tube companies in China and in Russia and in the former Czechoslovakia, I'm happy to say the tubes are as good as they've ever been, and in some cases better than they've ever been, because there's a couple of companies. Again, once the Soviet empire collapsed, those engineers, those government engineers needed a job, and we're telling them, okay, don't make satellite tubes, make guitar amp tubes. And kind of the same with the Chinese. Although the Chinese were a little bit more variable, they would be really good, and then they would we'd have some problems, and then we would go to someplace else and threaten them and so forth. So the point is that there was some competition, and that was good for everybody. That answer your question about tubes?
Yeah, pretty much, but it's still a viable thing for those companies to be able to produce that.
Yeah, but as long as they're geared up for that level. See, the trouble with the Sylvania factory, it was geared up to make something like 10 million tubes a year, and that's why it was just too big. It would be like the General Motors factory making 10 cars a year or a day. It'd be, like a tenth of 1% of what the factory's capable of. I saw a question over here. Yes, sir.
Right here. I have two quick questions.
Sure.
Kind of related. So, number one, do you design all of your own circuits?
Yes.
Do you have any help in-house helping you come up with those, or are you pretty much primarily?
The help that I have in-house, yeah, I got tremendous help in-house. Those guys play guitar, I noodle the circuit. And then when we think we got it pretty close to what we want, and again, we start out on a printed circuit board. Everything I've always done from the earliest boogies has been on a printed circuit board. It's one thing to be able to make a magic sounding amp. It's an order of magnitude more difficult to make every amp sound magical. And I've devoted myself to trying to figure that out, because I assume, we got a great reputation, and I don't want a guy going, I got an amp, it doesn't sound that good. I don't think you're gonna get 10 amps to find the magic one. And I got to thinking back at, with all of the fenders that I wrenched on over the decades, and there were the magic ones, and then there were the normal ones, and then there were the doggy ones. I had a dear friend of mine, good guitar player, bought just a cherry brown 410 concert amp, and he got a super deal on it because the guy said, yeah, it's a great amp, but it doesn't sound very good. The guy knows me, and he says, oh, wait a minute, my friend Randy, he can make that amp sound good. No, I never could. I replaced every part in that amp, and I couldn't get it to sound, it just had this wrong sound in the harmonics. Okay, now, when we were working on the dual rectifier, And I'll back up just for a second on that. You know, the boogies, I'm going back to that boosted Princeton and the little sports car with a V8 engine and all that. So they're boogies. I always like this idea of the little compact, friendly sidekick that blows your mind, right? Well, as you all know, the big hair metal days came up and the styles changed, especially down in LA, which isn't that far from us. Everybody wants big lineups, a big wall of Marshall stacks. And then guys were modifying the Marshalls and so forth. So we saw well, that's the future. I guess we ought to do something about that. Because we were making something we called the Stylist series. That was just an internal designation that we had, where our thought was, geez, you know, there's so many, the wonderful thing about guitar is that you can play so many different styles of music with the same guitar. And so let's design and create a different amp for each kind of different style. So we had the Blue Angel was, I think, the first one, because we thought, yeah, guys, there's guys that don't want gain, they don't want master volumes, they don't. In fact, one of the blues guys that worked there, he was a really gnarly guy, Mitch. You remember Mitch? Yeah. He used to play at Hell's Angel biker bars. That was Mitch. He was a wonderful guy, but he said, yeah, masters, that's for sissies. So we made this amp without the master. And it was okay, and we made the Maverick. That was a little bit different, and you know, it had its devotees. And then we made this thing called the dual rectifier, because we were looking for, well, you know, the metal guys, let's see what we can do for that. We had no expectation that the rectifier would become the monster that it was. But back to this notion of consistency. Okay, so let's give a comparison. See, I already said printed circuit boards, because the layout is the same. Because you have a high gain amp that's wired, you move the wires around, and not only does it get unstable and want to whistle and freak out and feedback and sound different, you just don't want that to happen, and that's eliminated with printed circuit boards. Every part is in exactly the same place, every trace is in exactly the same place, and believe you me, there's a real art to laying that out right. And especially if you start with a printed circuit board. Some people are mistaken, and they'll make what they call a point-to-point amp, and then they'll try to convert that to a printed circuit board. And then they're shocked that it doesn't sound the same. So my philosophy is we always start with a printed circuit board. It may be from some previous model that has a lot of similarities, but we start with a printed circuit board. When we develop it from that, then we'll make another version of that printed circuit board. Well, no matter what we did with this dual rectifier, we could not duplicate the sound of this first one that set our, it was our reference. And the way the harmonics layered on that was just so precious. And we literally spent 9 months before I finally figured out why that was and what it was. And again, it was this dichotomy between what the engineers would say. I know if there was and I'm not going to tell you the secret, because this is one of our deepest, most closely held trade secrets, is how we get this consistency. Okay, again, printed circuit boards, everything's in the same place. The components, we have all of this shit is personally made for us. The capacitors, they're made specially for us. The resistors, we use 1% tolerance resistors. Fender uses 10% tolerance. That means that 100K resistor could be 110 or 90K, right? It could be 10% up or 10% down. Ours are 1%, so it's either going to be 99 or 101. So that inconsistency is out. Nevertheless, there are these other areas where an engineer would tell you that can't make any difference, and yet we determined that it does make a difference in it. And again, this diligence, this persistence to try to plumb the depth of why are some amps magical. That's the only ones we want to make. We don't even want to make the mediocre ones. And then I got to thinking, I was looking at all the possible combinations and thinking back to the Fender days, and I went, you know, it correlates with that. It correlates with that. I can see that depending on all of the combinations that you can have, and I'm not going to tell you what they are, that you would wind up out of, 16 amps, you'd wind up with one great one, one terrible one. The middle ones would be they would all be the normal ones, and then it's almost like a bell-shaped curve. At any rate, statistically, it confirmed this thing. We still weren't convinced. So we started doing the Emperor. You know, we're worrying sometimes that we're getting too high, or we're suffering the Emperor's new clothes. So to confirm this theory that we came up with, that I discovered just by trial and error, basically, we started having guys, you know, our guys that work at Boogie, they're all guitar players, right? And I said, okay, you want to hear the difference? Oh yeah, I heard that difference. Well, how about this? Oh yeah, now those harmonics. How about this? Oh man, that line. So those harmonics sound great. So we did this over and over and over again with a half a dozen different guys, and they all, without knowing what we were doing, they heard what we were after, and then we realized this is it. We found why that magical inconsistency. We found how to avoid that inconsistency and make them all the same. My next worry was like, well, we don't want everybody figuring this out. So when we hand wire each Boogie, once it's wired, you can't tell because of the way we do this. It just looks like anybody else would have wired the amp. Again, I wish I could tell you what it was, but if you didn't have the technical thing, it might not mean anything to you anyway. But trust me, and take a guy like Andy Timmons, Steve's good friend here. When we were coming up with a Lone Star, he got, I think we sent the prototype number 3 or something like that to you. Andy played it, he freaked out, he just loved the thing. And then he was like, well, dude, I have to have that one. And I said, no, that one's for Steve. No, dude, I know, I've had these boutique amps, and I know how inconsistent they are. I've got to have that one. We said, you can't have it, but we'll send you one that you can do the blindfold test, and you can tell us if you can tell the difference. That's the other thing that we use when we're comparing a tonal reference to the next generation is the blindfold test. Because I realized right away with Doug West, when he's our tone boy, when we take the one that we've been working on for months, and I've got the next generation. Okay, I've taken all of the mods that we've done on this, and I've laid it out properly on the circuit board for this one. Now let's compare them. And I realized looking at him, I plug into the one that's the reference, he's like, oh yeah, and I plug into the other one, he's immediately like, his body English, he's tense, he's doubtful and all of that. And so I had to come up with this thing. I was like, you're prejudicing this, because you know that one sounds good, and you're suspicious that this one isn't going to, and you're making it not sound as good. So turn around, don't look. And then what we do is I end up plugging in from one amp to the other, but not A, B, A, B, A, B. It's like A, B, A, B, B, A, B, and then he's got to be going, okay, that's the first one. And so what we're looking for that convinces me that he doesn't know which one is which is when he's wrong half of the time. See, if he's wrong every time, then he just doesn't know which one is which, but there is a difference. And so I'll plug in, and he doesn't know whether it's the same amp or whether I've switched amps. So I'll unplug it and then plug in the same amp, and he'll go, okay, and then I'll plug in the other amp, and he'll go, that's the same amp. And then I'll plug in it again, and he say, I think that's the other amp. See what I'm getting at? He can't tell. And then we know that we're getting it right. So going back to Andy Timmons, we sent him an amp. Did he do the blindfold test, or did he just?
Yeah, I did it.
You did it.
Yeah, I did it.
At any rate, he is a total believer. And then he goes on a world tour, some months later, and he's being furnished gear by our distributors in Spain and England and various places. And he comes and goes, dude, those amps were all magic. Every one, I couldn't have taught, any one of them was as good as what I think is my one and only amp. Give me another question, right here.
I appreciate the passion that you shared about playing in the moment from a sax player's perspective, about the the LA scene. You had the proximity to that, the evolution a little bit on the 2C heavy metal scene. We know about Petrucci, the work that you've done with him. I've been a theater fan since day one. And my question is about doing business. From when you started, you had the ability, not knowing what you're doing, but you're going with your passion, and you met people, and things happen, right? And you develop relationships. That's the way of doing business then. In today's society, we've got social media. From a marketing perspective.
Maybe everybody can hear you.
Hi. Whoa. There we go. I need longer arms. Okay. From a marketing perspective today, we have so many tools to grow and run our business, whether it's social media or reaching consumers in a different way that you did way back in the day, meaning the artist handshake by handshake. what is the biggest thing you're gonna do differently in the years ahead that you haven't done yet? And what's not perfect yet?
Nothing. I'll take the mic back. Nothing. No, I mean, look, what we got is kind of unique. I've been offered, I don't know how many times, to buy out Mesa Boogie, you know, big companies want to buy it, and now they've stopped, because for years it was like, not for sale. I'm not interested. I don't play golf. I don't need to retire. Designing amps is what I do. I got a great crew. 2 of them are right over here. I've got devotees like this, like your store right here. These guys, I'm fulfilled. Now I get to do what I like to do, which is design the stuff and see it come, and it's like being able to build race cars or hot rods and see them make people real happy. And I don't have to deal with payroll. I don't have to order parts anymore. Again, I've done all of that. I've been the guy on the phone talking to people, and you know, in the early days, I did every bit of it. I don't see the need to change, really. And you know, people go, "Why don't you do an offshore?" But here's the things that a couple of magazine guys have said. Number one, why don't you do a low-price offshore brand? Well, we don't want to do that. That'll undermine the legitimacy of what we do. Everybody else is doing that already. You're making commodity gear at that point, and we don't need more commodity gear. We've got a niche. The other thing the guy said, this is Art Thompson, editor-in-chief and guitar player, he said, well, why don't you make just like a super special where you just do the best, most expensive parts and the most, everything that you can possibly do to, you know, and just have this extra level of super desirable high quality. And I said, we do. You do? And I said, yeah, every amp is done that way. From the most expensive to the least expensive, the components are all the same. It's not like, oh, we're gonna put the cheap capacitors in this one and the expensive capacitor. No, it's not that way. In terms of the artist model, there is no selection, oh, this is a great one, let's give it to this artist or something like that. It's just an amp, because we got this consistency thing going on. Yeah, they'll test the amps. The biggest inconsistency really comes into the speakers as well. Yes, sir?
When you're designing, are you looking at the line and saying like, this is missing, or I can improve on something else, or is there anything in particular that you're looking for?
Yeah, there's, I'm looking for, you know, wandering around in search of greatness with some ideas of where to go, because again, I've been doing this a long time, so I've kind of got ideas about what works, and then it's just, again, we're just a bunch of guys that sit around and dream up what would be cool. Just a second, and I'll get to your, and then it's up to me to try to deliver it. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll start in on an amplifier thinking that it's going to be this way, and by the time we're finished with it, it's that way. But it had to be this way in order to go somewhere else and then wind up.
So you had a run of like nuclear holocaust amps with the rectifier coming all the way up through the JP2C, the TCs. Now you did the two, I guess we'll consider, I think most of us consider those the low gain amps.
Right.
Even though they're not really low gain, but lower gain.
They'll rock pretty hard, but not quite into the metal sphere, right?
So with those two being out of the way, are you coming back with another high gain monster for your next one? Or what's next in line?
I'd love to tell you, but Steve would kill me.
And
it's so far in the future that it could be, what it winds up could be so different than anything I would tell you that's under process right now that it would be meaningless. But I'm always working on the next amp and the one after that. Right here, please.
Speaking of pedals, a lot of pedals these days, they come with stereo outputs, like delay, reverb. Not a lot of amps can accommodate that. Like for example, you know, with a stereo effects loop and stereo inputs, did you ever consider maybe building an amp that you can plug those pedals in and take
Yeah, I made
advantage
some
of it?
stereo stuff way back when, and the demand for it was minuscule. That was it. I live to serve. There's a lot of great ideas that don't have enough, even at our small level, enough commercial potential to make it worthwhile. Yeah, we did do some stereo stuff. stereo satellites. We had, you know, the Mark IV had the stereo satellites and stuff, and we sold a few of them, but, you know, most guys in the stereo, you know, they end up not using it. I mean, some do, some don't.
Well, demand is going up, especially, I mean, the rectifier cabs, they have like stereo inputs, you know, that would be interesting. But you know, like a smaller amp head,
Yeah,
something like that.
well,
People are talking about it.
I wouldn't say no, but again, to be stereo, you have to have another speaker, and to be any good stereo, it needs to be a separation, so it might as well be a separate box, and that's what we've done. And again, that's what guys like Petrucci have, 2 heads, 2 cabs, and they use their stereo delays, and they make that work. And, you know, that goes all the way back to Lukather and the studio days. We were doing that way back in the Mark II Cs, and what was that, the early 80s. We were actually doing that, but it wasn't in one piece of gear. It was in, so, yes, sir.
What was the design inspiration behind the Mesa Boogie Mark III and the Simulclass circuit?
Good questions. The Mark III, 3 modes. That's why it wasn't called the Mark II-D, which I was thinking of, Mark II, you know, A, B, C, and Mark II-D, and I thought, no, let's distinguish 3 modes, because it had clean, crunch, and the crunch, I was listening to Eddie Van Halen, and I'm thinking, well, that's in between. That's neither super high gain nor clean. Wonderful tone. And he actually really liked the 2C. I don't know if he ever recorded with him, but I was with him when he tried one. He said, wow, that's a great sounding amp. Again, the trouble with rock stars is they don't have the patience that we need to actually sit and try. Maybe Eddie does now. He's made some great products, I guess, but you know, it's like you got 5 seconds. You're like, no, I don't like that. How about this? Yeah, I like that. That's good. But in terms of what we have to do about get down and we literally, I mentioned something about the transformers. We go through every grade of iron and the transformer, every diameter of wire. I mean, we go crazy, and even stuff where the voltages all look the same, but the sound is different, the impact. One of the things that we're looking for that you get out of a great tube amp is this sort of morphing dynamic characteristic where you hit a note and it goes, wow, you know, and it's interesting. Instead of just a straight ahead note. It's part of the magic, and the way the harmonics shift and morph and pile on top of each other. That's partly due to all the voltages changing as a result of a signal going through the amplifier. Dual rectifier, here's a perfect example of how that works. Why dual rectifier? Okay, because originally rectification, that's the process of changing AC into DC, was accomplished with a vacuum tube. Okay, then when solid state stuff started to become developed, the first thing that was developed is a diode. That diode means two elements, and that also converted AC to DC. Technically, it did a way better job, and here's why. With a silicon diode rectifier, there is no change in the voltage drop. The voltage drop always is 0.6 of a volt, no matter how much you try to suck out of it or whether you suck nothing out of it. It's 0.6 of a volt. A tube rectifier depends entirely on how much current is being drawn through. That's why there's so many different ones of them. Take a 5U4, say, in a dual rectifier. Just sitting there idle, it's already dropping the voltage by 20 volts or so, and the louder you play, the more it drops, because it has an internal resistance to it. Well, that gives you a tactile sensation that actually you can feel. The point about the dual rectifier is that both are valid. And so I wanted to come up with an amplifier that would give you the instant choice between the dynamic characteristics of a tube rectifier and the stiffness of a solid state rectifier. That was part of it. All the rest of it, the gain, the EQ, and all of that even can remain the same. That gets me onto this Dynawatt, which is something I came up with long before the dual rectifier, but it's the same thing about enhancing the dynamics. Here's why that's really interesting. There's an element in a power tube called the screen grid that works like a catalyst. The more voltage on the screen grid, the more sensitive the power tube is. And when I say sensitive, that means it'll put out more power with a smaller signal going into it. It's more sensitive. That's the same as gain. Okay, so I'm thinking, let's play around with that, because in a hi-fi amp, that would be stiff and the voltage would never change. But in a guitar amp, that voltage changes a little bit under load. The louder you play, the more it drops down, and it bounces up and down. So I thought, how about you enhance that? Let's separate that with from the normal power supply and put a great big capacitor at the end. And we're gonna make it like a flash bulb where it stores up the charge, like a flash bulb on a camera, stores up the charge and then bam, and it's just seems really bright. It actually isn't that much light, but it's all compacted. And that's why it seems so bright, because it's all instantaneous. Picking a guitar string is about as dynamic as anything gets, because the attack is real explosive. Bam, the voltage goes way up and then it dies down. So what this Dynawatt does is it allows the amplifier to be really sensitive. It's just like just waiting for something to happen so that it can amplify it like crazy. But as soon as it happens, then the sensitivity drops way down. And I thought, that's really interesting, but what I'm gonna have to do is find out how much does the voltage sag for how long before it builds back up. Well, that's just what they call a time constant. It's a combination of a resistor and a capacitor. And you know, the resistance determines how fast the capacitor charges back up. So then I thought, well, the trouble with this idea is that probably every style of guitar player is gonna want a different time constant. So I set it up on a dial so that I could just sweep through a whole bunch of different values, and then I had our players. So what do you think? And the guy's going, wow, that's really stiff. Oh, it's getting easier to play. Oh man, that is so easy to play. Oh, it's all falling apart now. What happened? What happened? Back up. Oh yeah, there it is, there it is. Bottom line, here's one thing that's so amazing and interesting about guitar. What I just said, and this is something we pay particular attention to, is the tactile. The guitar player has a tactile sense of playing. That's how it feels in your hands, and there's the auditory sense, and that's how it sounds in your ear. And the amplifier is in between. Totally fascinates me to be able to sit there with a dial and have the guitar player going, oh, it's so hard to play my guitar. It's so stiff and unforgiving. Oh, now it's getting responsive and juicy. Oh, I really feel like playing. Oh, now it's all falling apart and it's just all mushy and doesn't work. So we back up into that, oh man, it's making my guitar seem really inviting. But here's the point I'm getting at. I'm not changing the string tension. I'm not changing the action. I'm not changing anything. And yet the guitar player is sitting there saying, depending on what I'm doing with the amplifier and these time constants, he is convinced. He's feeling that it's going from too hard and too revealing, which is pretty much what normal amplifiers are like. By comparison, when you start doing this Dynawatt technique, when it gets more inviting and easier to play. And it's another thing that we always check when we're evolving amplifiers, is that our main tone boy, Doug West, comes in cold in the morning. He may be working on it all day and into the late night. We're working, geeking out trying to develop the amplifier. But he comes in cold and wants to know right away, is it easy to play? Does it invite me in? Or is it like, this is stiff, I don't feel like playing? So we're going for that. It makes you want to play. Again, I want to reiterate the main point that I find so interesting is changing the time constant values of voltages shifting in the amplifier affects how the guitar feels. You got that? And yet nothing is changing in the guitar, but it's this difference between the tactile sensation of playing and the auditory sensation of playing. The guitar player thinks it's changed. And so that's what we want. Oh man, I plugged into that book and I just went off. And we've had this happen with some great players. Greg DiBenedetto, a Marshall guy, for example. And he said, he started playing the most phenomenal stuff. And he said, I don't know what's happening. Something magic is happening. I don't play like this. And he was just freaking out over this thing. And it was really gratifying for me, especially. He said, I don't play guitar. To see this guy say, I don't know what happened. I don't play that well, but I just did. And there's no more gratifying thing than that, really, is to have a guy, because again, with a horn, you struggle with a sax, you struggle with that damn reed and all this shit. And I just remember at a gig one time, there was a gal showed up with a Selmer Mark 6, and she played in a Las Vegas show band. She said, you want to try my sax? It played so easy and so good, I couldn't believe it. And I felt like, man, I can actually play like a real big boy with this thing. And not that my sax wasn't okay, but hers was so easy to play. And so that's what we're looking for. Give me another question, right here.
Studio preamp, do you use clipping diodes in the gain stage?
No, we never do that.
No
That's,
clipping.
that's what, clipping diode, no, we're tube guys, and clipping diodes, that's solid state distortion. And again, I'm being descriptive, I don't wanna put a negative, spin on it, because guys can get good sounds out of that. I've used that notion in this case is to prevent the reverb from being overdriven. So you'd never know it was there, but for example, if you, in some earlier models, I think it was the dual calibers, for example, when you went to the high gain stuff, it tried to nail a reverb send circuit way too hard, and so I put some clipping diodes in there. There were just voltage limiters so that you couldn't overdrive the reverb and make it sound really shitty. Give me another question. These are good questions. What's for dessert? Anybody want to know? Yes, sir.
What's your thoughts about new old stock components in comparison to today's components? And are there any audible, noticeable differences when using them?
Yeah, good question. I'm not going to restrict that to new old stock. In the case of tubes, yeah, that might be, there would be something to that in the case of tubes, because tubes are pretty vital, they're pretty magical. And we were talking about that earlier, about some tubes that I helped develop that were really great, and then they don't make them anymore, and so forth and so on. Since we make a substantial number of amplifiers, we can't use new old stock stuff, and we don't want somebody to buy an amplifier that has new old stock NOS tubes or NOS parts, and then they can't keep it up. You know, we want to be there to serve the guy. In fact, what I hear when I do things like this, I have people come up, I bought an amp in 1977 or 1974 or 1981, and I've loved it, blah, blah, blah. And we're still here to support that. And if it need be, you can send the amp back to the factory. We will do whatever it needs, usually not very much, to keep it working. But NOS stuff, now let me get off onto this topic, because this is really interesting too. Let's talk about the components. I already mentioned capacitors. We have capacitors custom made using a proprietary polypropylene, blah, 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 because they sound good to us, they sound right. And they would be in the category of the high-end audiophile grade capacitor. Let's talk about resistors. I read an interesting report that a guy wrote, a white paper, and some PhD engineer, and it was ridiculous. He spent 32 pages trying to answer the question of, do different resistor compositions, different types of resistors sound different in an audio circuit? Can different types of resistors sound different in an audio circuit? And his conclusion, after all of this algebra and engineering gobbledygook, after 32 pages, he says, maybe it might be possible. And I'm thinking, dude, come hang out with me, and I will show you the difference between a metal film resistor and one metal. Amplifier's got 248 resistors. I'll take one of them and change it from a metal film to a carbon comp. You're going to hear a huge difference. Same value. I mean, you can measure them exactly the same value. Huge difference in the way it sounds. So when we're developing an amp, again, I already have an idea in my mind. If this is going to be a more vintagey sounding amp, I'm going to start using more of the carbon comp resistors. And if it's a more metal and modern sounding amp where it's got impact, then I'm going to use many more of the metal film resistors. That's just a small example of how, because they sound completely different. Most of our amps use a mix of the two, because we'll go into almost every critical part and try 2 or 3, even with a carbon comp resistor. Allen Bradley's sound lousy and Omar's sound good. They look exactly the same. They measure exactly the same. They are supposedly exactly the same part. They don't sound the same. So the takeaway is that every component in a guitar amp, even in a stereo amp, is a tone control, especially in a guitar amp.
Another question.
Right here.
How many volts do you have to get up to before you can get tube distortion, say in the preamp tubes with the 12AX7s?
How many volts do you have to get up to?
Yeah, what kind of power supply are you looking at to start getting into that? In the
It's a
preamp
question
stage.
without a simple
Preamp
answer.
stage.
There isn't a given voltage.
No.
There isn't a given voltage for that. That's something else that we work with, the power supply and the power supply arrangement. including the voltages and which comes first and how they're sourced is also really vital. But there is no standard answer, like at 240 volts, they'll start to distort or they won't. It has to do with what's the cathode value. Is there a cathode bypass capacitor? That's gonna change it depending on the frequency, so it's a really complex deal, although it's the kind of deal where you can hear it, but there's no point in trying to measure it or engineer it, especially for us, because the whole goal is what does it sound like, not, oh, does it spec well? What's a good spec for a guitar amp? Nobody knows. It's distortion, and it's the opposite of hi-fi amp, because you don't want a flat frequency response, and you do want some distortion, even when you're playing clean stuff. You know, if you get a laboratory amp with no distortion, sounds terrible. Any other questions here? I'm having a good time, but it might be bedtime for somebody. Yeah, right here,
I
right,
just
sure.
wanted to get your take on your philosophy about having the bias non-adjusted in your amplifier.
A bias adjustment, is that what you were
Yeah.
asking about?
You make
Yeah.
it non-adjusted.
Well, I think that too many people pay too much money to get their amps biased. And my philosophy is, you shouldn't have to roll out a prayer rug and pay a guy to replace a 6L6. That's all I'm thinking. Now, if you look at, yeah, good, you got the joke there. It's a hoax. So many were, well, I biased your amp, so that's an extra $35 or something like that. Okay, so Fenders all had a bias adjustment pot. And for the life of me, I can't tell why, because they all say set it at minus 52 volts. So when we don't use exactly that voltage, we determine what's the best bias voltage, again, by listening. And there's always a sweet spot where it sounds the best. And we wire that value, we hardwire that value in so it's not adjustable, because this notion of, oh, and you think about it, 52 volts, okay, that's a good starting point. I agree with you there, but is that with what voltage out of the wall socket? They don't specify. So, and that goes up and down. So it's not really necessary, except in the case that if you want to make tubes that are so far out of the ideal spec work better, then there is some purpose. But it's sort of like, it would be sort of like if you got the wrong size tire on your car, you're going to compensate by adjusting the air pressure in the tire. You're better off just having the right size tire and the right size tire pressure in the thing. And so with our tubes, our power tubes are all, now first of all, we work with the manufacturer. Secondly, they screen them, then they give them to us. We screen them again into a narrow field of what's an acceptable range, and we send back everyone that's not within our acceptable range. And then they get relabeled as anybody else's tubes. And this is the same thing back at the Sylvania factory. They said, hey, it's like the cherry-picked tubes or the STR 415 that are your spec. The next spec, which is way wider and most of them comply, is 387, that's Fender spec. And I said, well, what does Groove Tubes use? And he says, whatever else is left over. There's no spec, and that's why they had this thing, and I'm being descriptive. I don't want to think that I'm taking a dump on that idea, although I kind of am. You've got these real weak tubes, and he's, oh yeah, well, the weak tubes sound this way, and the strong tubes sound that way, and all that. Well, we're after this consistency, and we don't want to try to make some magical aura about tubes that are really inconsistent. We figured out the way we think the tube should be, set that standard, and then we want them to meet that standard. That's the way that works. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that one of the hardest things is supply for vacuum tubes, and you've also mentioned that you sometimes have inconsistent supply, say from the Chinese manufacturers. You have a lot of variability. So I'm wondering, do any of your people from your company go to the manufacturer, considering that almost all of this is by ear, tested by ear, or do you just have them send you lots?
And the manufacturer's rep put his office across the street from our factory.
Okay, I got you.
And they take back anything that we don't approve. And again, I say that's after they've already tested them and sent them to us. We retest every tube within our more narrow parameters and more carefully tested over 7 different elements is the way that the tubes get tested. And anything that we're not happy with, we just give back, and he sells it to somebody else. So the impetus for them is to get it right.
Totally cool. Follow-up question, very simple. Have you been surprised by a tube that somebody sent you that was out of your internal spec that might have led to development of a new circuit or something like that? Have
No.
they sent you something?
No, and what I'm interested in is 12AX7s, 6L6s, EL84s, 12, well, even the 12AT7s aren't so critical, but the least number of different tube types.
Yeah.
They're the right tubes to use. It would be sort of like, okay, what's the best wood for the top of an acoustic guitar? Spruce, right? And that's pretty much what everybody, yeah, you could do some redwood ones, but there's not a lot of, it's already kind of known. We already kind of know what we want, and we want to keep it. We want to keep it to that. There's so much you can do with just those tubes. And once again, we don't want to have a situation where 5 years or 2 years or 10 years later, the guy can't get that tube. And it's like, oh man, that tube went out and I can't get it anymore. That's why I don't want to use some wacky weirdo tube. And the other reason is, again, if as an original equipment manufacturer, if we, and that would be Fender, me, and the other boutique guys, can supply enough market, then these companies will continue to make the tubes. But again, they're not gonna make tubes for a color TV set, and they're not, oh, I wish I had a one blah-de-blah tube that did this, you know, yeah, we're not gonna make it for you.
Well, my question is if manufacturing defects can cause problems with the sound, there must also be the opposite case, right? That sometimes a manufacturing defect gives you a better sound. So this is what I was asking, is have you actually received tubes?
No, because once again, if it's defective, that means it's not performing to what we're trying to duplicate, what is our standard reference. And I can't really picture a tube being, well, here's how I can picture it. A preamp tube would be better if it was less noisy. That's the downfall with 12AX7s, is the microphonicity of them, or the hum. And we have ways to deal with both of those, but the microphonicity is pretty hard to deal with. That's a manufacturing spec. So, but in terms of them, oh, it's got this magic sound. I will say that different manufacturers' tubes do sound different, just like the resistors that I talk about. And we will find a tube that we think is the best match for a particular amplifier and use it. Again, along the assumption that there will be a steady supply of them. Not only that we can, make enough of them, but that later on, when the guy, should he need a replacement, that he can get one. That's right in there. Yes, sir, way back here.
Speaking of supplies, you also, a lot of times you'll discontinue an amplifier because you can't get a component anymore.
Yeah.
I can see how, as the engineer, you're looking at it like, I don't wanna change the component out to something that's available, but, do you find
You want
that,
an example? I can give you a great example of that. Both the best and the worst. The 6L6 was invented in the 1930s, and it's still unsurpassed for audio. You know the famous Mark Levinson? Some guys were talking about high-end audio. Mark Levinson was the king of high-end. He practically invented high-end audio with solid-state stuff. He's come around to think that the 6L6 is the most musical amplification device ever made. This is the last thing I ever heard about from him. Now think about how few electronic components have been the best thing for a given job from the 30s to 2020. Now, solid state stuff, yeah, there's an issue with with the relays that would be in an amp like this or in a Mark V to mute. The relays are what changed the circuit to go from one mode to another mode, say. Okay, but when they're doing that, they can produce a hellacious pop. So, and this has always been a big problem. How do you get rid of the pop? Anybody here have a 2A or a 2B? You would know about the foot switch pop. So I wanted to get rid of that. And the best way to do that I came up with, is to mute the amplifier for the instant that the pop occurs. And so what we used was an FET, a field effect transistor. So you would think that those would remain available, but they're not. They're getting harder and harder and harder to find. Now, this is a part that I don't know how old it is, 10 years or something. It's certainly not, what, from the 30s to now? How long is that? That's like 70, 80 years or something like that. So yeah, that could be a problem. And we're working around that problem by coming up with a different way to do that, that mute, so that we don't have to rely on these anymore, because we can see the writing on the wall is that they're, you know, we bought like thousands of them, and they're just getting harder and harder to find. And the value that we liked best, the J174, they don't make anymore at all. You can get the 175, which is almost the same, but is not as consistent. So we have to deal with that. So there's a bit of what you're talking about, but that doesn't really affect tone. That only affects this instant that we're trying to mute the pop. I saw another question come up here. Yes, sir.
Can you use a pull-down resistor to stop the pop, or?
No, you gotta short it right out. Let me ask this gentleman right back there. That was a good idea. That's basically what we do, but you don't want a resistor. You want it as low as possible. You want to short that out. So the resistance, that's part of what the trouble is. A J174 goes lower than a 175. It does a better job of muting and shorting out that signal for that moment. This gentleman back here had a question.
Just a quick question. I do love Mark series, and then what was your initial concept of a Mark series amp?
Wait a second here, I can't hear you.
I really love Mark series amps, and then that's just such great, you know, amps, and for a long period of time. And then, what was your initial concept of the philosophy of Mark series, and how has it been changed, and how it's going to change in the future? And
Mark 3 you're talking about?
all the Mark series, Mark 1, Mark 2, C+, Mark 3 have this distinctive sound.
One of our flagship.
Yes. And I also love to know, I really love quad preamps, but then you guys discontinued a long time ago. Quad. Yeah. So will you ever run the rerun of that amp, like the preamp, like you did to
Nah, because that was part of the era where racks, people wanted big racks, and I would love to see that become a trend again, but I don't expect that it will. The trend's kind of the opposite. It is to smaller and lighter instead of bigger and heavier. And some of those racks, like a Lukather and a lot of those studio cats have, they're like small refrigerators full of so much stuff. A couple of our power amps, a couple of preamps like that quad preamp, they had their day. They set the stage, and again, it was revolutionary stuff. Here's a couple of other things that we did that I guess I can say I did, which was effects loop. That didn't exist beforehand. Somebody mentioned simulclass. That didn't exist beforehand. The high gain didn't exist beforehand. Channel switching. Actually, I want to call it mode switching. That didn't exist before. That would be two modes, you know, clean and lead. And then, like somebody said, what about the Mark III that had clean, crunch, and lead, high gain? And then, so to answer your question too about the Mark series, it's been, again, our flagship because it comes from the Mark I, which was the original Boogie. It wasn't called a Mark I until they came up with the Mark II, which it had the two separate presettable sounds, the clean and the lead. So, and of course the Mark V and its offshoots, the 525 and 535, people love them. They're super versatile, and the number of sounds you can get out of them is just great, and they're authentic sounds. Graphic equalizer, that's something else I came up with, putting that on the front of a little guitar amp. Anything else, a slave out, most people don't use that, but it's there. Anything else that's
You nailed the biggies right there.
yeah, those are kind of the biggies, but you know, a lot of that stuff like gain and switching, channel, I keep calling it channel switching since everybody else does, that's almost become generic, but remember, that didn't exist before I stumbled into it.
Not like the best thing you've come up with for convenience is the MIDI switching.
The MIDI switching, yeah,
that's
we're finally
remarkable.
catching up with that.
That's remarkable
Yeah.
because you say not many people use racks, but small racks, you know, I have like all my pedals, I have them all racked. I have a switcher, all MIDI together, and it's beautiful. Hit one button, it changes everything on my amp. puts the pedals the way I want them, it's fantastic. I mean,
I love the concept.
This is like, that's why I was asking about the tri-axis before. Do you ever plan on going back to, designing another kind of, preampy style, fully full MIDI kind of thing?
What do you think, Steve?
We don't really, I mean, the rack thing is tough. I mean, just look around, most people are shifting to pedals with amplifiers and using switchers. Just kind of like what you're doing. If you go beyond that game, digital is going down in price, modeling is going down in price, analog's never gonna go down in price. So that's why it's a really,
Even a lot of guys,
it's not
even a lot of guys using like Axe Effects and Line 6 and all these other things, they're still sticking analog pedals in those chains.
yeah, I know.
A lot of guys with the Axe Effects still rely on a few choice analog pedals to make them
Yeah,
sound.
but the core of it is digital modeling, right? So I mean, it's just one of those things. It's not our forte. Plus, most people are buying those for the convenience of all the sounds they can get, the built-in effects. We don't do effects. So if you don't have a really way to have a very competitive effect suite, again, that if you take a look at that market, Axe Effects, Kemper, all cool stuff. I mean, taking nothing away from those guys because it's convenient and it does serve a purpose, but that's not the same thing that we do. We're focused on doing the real thing and integrating in more ways to use the real thing, So yeah, sorry, tri-axis. Like Randy said, if we could get LDR, that goes all the way back to LDRs, which we haven't used forever.
Light-dependent resistors.
Yeah.
And there's
I'm gonna
another
have to
case
go on
of,
eBay and get myself a used.
We don't get the request hardly ever. You're the first. We've been doing a mini
no
tour
one
of
even
these.
brings
You're the
that
first
up?
person to bring that up.
Just round up a
It's-
couple 100,000 of your friends. Same request, we have that kind of thing.
We'd love to do it.
And tri-axis.
Love that.
I would love to do it.
Yeah, we love hearing that, and we wish, like Randy said, we wish nothing more than the rack revolution would come back. But sadly, I think what we're going to see is what's that?
Fun stuff.
Yeah, fun stuff. It was fun stuff, but it's not many guys are that committed anymore. Sadly, it's.
well, and the other thing is, you guys run a music store, you're dealers, and you don't wanna put a great big investment in something that has such a small sales, potential. And that's why, now, if we were only making custom stuff, you could probably come in and pay some ridiculous $20,000, $30,000 and get one made, maybe, I don't know, but it's not practical for us to do. Because just like Steve said, there just isn't much demand for it. The band's almost the other way around, it's for simpler and less stuff.
But you still service the tri-axis, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, still, it's a
So I
great
think I gotta
piece.
get the membrane replaced on the front line.
Tri-axis 290, it's a killer rig.
What is the strategy?
I kept my original 290.
Just give us a call, customer service a call, Monday through Thursday. If you need some service on your tri-axis, give us a call. If you need a membrane front for it, we can take care of you.
All right, great.
Speaking of the counterpart to the tri-axis, one of them, the Coliseum 300 power amp.
Oh, that's awesome.
The power section of 2 triple rectifiers. What were you thinking?
Crazy guy.
And thank you, by the way.
I can tell you what he was thinking, because I love this line that you used to use when we were talking about that. When excess is barely enough.
Yeah, thank you.
That's what he was thinking.
When excess is barely enough, yeah. It's that hot rod dragster mentality,
Top fuel in that
Yeah,
case.
top fuel, that's good. Last couple of questions, yes, sir.
I'm a big fan of Mesa Boogie amps. I'm on my 4th one.
Thank
I
you.
love it, and being that you're here tonight, I feel very honored to be here and hear you talk and get to meet you a little bit, hear your story. It's great. I wanted to ask you were talking a little bit about how sometimes 12AX7s have a hum. Yeah, I'm having a bit of a problem with a hum on the clean channel.
Change the first
Swap.
12AX7, the one
Swap the
nearest the
D1.
input jack. Just
Yeah.
try swapping that and see if that doesn't help, because often that's all it is. You were thanking me, I wanna thank you guys, not only this whole crowd, but guitar players worldwide, because it's only through you guys that I've been able to have to be able to do what I think I was ultimately born to do, even though I didn't know it. You know, that going back to that same notion of my granny not knowing, what the destination was. So how do you know when she's arrived? Well, I put it more simply than that. My destination is the journey, because, like I started to say, or maybe I didn't say it this time, when I thought I had the Mark I and I had given guys gain and separated it from playing loudness, that was the complaint that I kept hearing, and I solved that. But then they said, well, yeah, but it would be nice to be able to switch it to a clean sound. And then, okay, we do that. Yeah, but it would be really nice if we had separate tone controls for both sounds. Well, but it would be really nice if we had an in-between gain sound. See, so you guys never quit, and you keep me going, and it's what I like doing. So, and I couldn't do it without you guys, and I have the highest regard and respect, and I want to thank you for trusting Mesa Boogie and me and all of us, primarily me, with your tone and with your hard-earned cash, because we're here to serve and make you happy. And if we can't make you happy, well, here's the founding principles of the company. They couldn't be simpler. Make the best products possible. Going back to that guy cutting up the wood carving, right? What does this garbage say about you? No, we want to make the best possible, no excuses. And the second one is just nothing more than a golden rule. Treat everybody the way you yourself would like to be treated. Simple, nothing more than that. And anybody, whatever your business or career is, if you do that, I'm pretty damn sure you'll be successful. Thank you all very much. And thanks to Thank you. These fellows have got the passion, they got the knowledge, they've got the inventory, and you guys are lucky to have these fellows here to be our go-between between us and you guys and your playing.